Chris, hello again.
Hello. Yeah.
So, as we met a few weeks ago in Vilnius, I understood that your main scientific interests are East Asian pop culture.
I would say East Asian cinema.
East Asian cinema. The occasion that we met was the Taiwan Film Days in Vilnius. Specifically, sorry if I pronounce it wrongly, Taiyupian films.
That's right, yes. We were pleased to be able to do this for, I think it's the third time we were screening these Taiwanese language films in Vilnius.
So, just to have some context, can you describe the beginning and the development of Taiwan cinema? How did it start and how it went?
Do you mean Taiwanese cinema in general, or specifically these Taiwanese language films?
I would like to have some context in general, and then after that we can specify a bit.
Okay,
about that,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Taiwan was a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, and during that period, the Japanese regarded Taiwan almost as the last island in the archipelago. So they treated Taiwan pretty much as part of the Japanese film market. And they didn't try to develop a production base on Taiwan itself. Of course, some films used it as a location. There were some documentaries made, but there was no regular film production on Taiwan in that period. And Taiwan was a market for films coming from Tokyo, but also from Shanghai and also from Hollywood, and probably in some cases also from Europe. After the end of what we call World War II, the Japanese returned to Japan, and Taiwan was handed over to China, which at that point was under the control of the KMT, Kuomintang Nationalist Party, headed up by Chiang Kai-shek. And he was a right-wing politician, although he trained in Moscow, interestingly. But he was a right-wing politician, and he was in a civil war with the Chinese Communist Party. As we all know, they won the civil war. So in the end, he retreated to Taiwan. And Taiwan, at that point, although not recognized as an independent country in its own right, became governed separately from the People's Republic on the mainland. Initially, the new government from the mainland emphasized mostly things like documentaries and newsreels rather than feature films, and with a few exceptions, but not many. And feature filmmaking really started in the form of commercial, very low budget films, which today we call Taiwanese language cinema. And these are the films that we were showing in Vilnius. They are largely a forgotten cinema, and only recently have they been, the surviving films have been restored, and they're being shown around, and we've been happy to put together some screening tours and show them around Europe.
But those films were made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if I'm right.
They were made from 1956 on, and then they came to a stop in the early 1970s. The reason for the start and the end is that I need to explain, first of all, a little more that on the island, the local population spoke a dialect, but a dialect that is so different from Mandarin, it's almost a different language, which they call Taiwanese, and academic linguists call it Minnanhua. And they didn't understand Mandarin, the language that came from the mainland with the new government. So local producers, who were initially theatrical producers, stage producers, began to see the possibility of a market for films made in this local language referred to as Taiwanese. And that's why they started making the films in the mid-50s. Before this, some films in the same language were coming from Hong Kong, but because the population that could consume those films was larger in Taiwan, the strength of the market enabled local production to take over from Hong Kong production pretty quickly. And they were producing, in some cases, maybe as many as 100 films a year. Overall, they produced at least 1,000 films, and according to some records, maybe as many as 2,000 films over the period of about 15 to 20 years, from the mid-50s to the early to mid-70s. There are lots of arguments about what killed off the Taiwanese language industry, but certainly one important factor is the rise of television in Taiwan in the late 60s. The television stations were also in this local language, this Taiwanese language. Television was free, so once people had bought a set, they didn't want to go spend money on movie tickets so much. The films themselves were very, very popular before television took off, but nonetheless, it has to be acknowledged that they were low-budget films, and so they didn't have the kind of visual spectacle that might enable them to compete with television. We all know that Hollywood in the 50s used things like widescreen and other kinds of spectacular techniques to try and compete with television, but that wasn't so much an option for Taiwanese language cinema.
Where did the industry go?
The Taiwanese language industry just died, basically. But the film industry, of course, also included Mandarin language films. And the government was encouraging Mandarin language learning at school. And by the time you got into the 1960s, you had the first generation of local kids who had learned Mandarin as a second language and were fluent enough in it that they could understand and enjoy films in Mandarin. The government itself also supported Mandarin language cinema. They put money into it because they saw the Mandarin language as the national language, meaning Chinese national language. They saw Taiwan as part of China, and their cultural project was to assimilate Taiwan into this national Chinese culture that they imagined and tried to uphold. And so Mandarin language films got more and more frequent. And in the 1970s, although there were a lot of problems for the industry because of television, it survived as a Mandarin language industry. And then in the 1980s, we had the sudden appearance of the Taiwan New Cinema, as it's known, the art house films that are associated with people like Hou Xiaoxian and Edward Yang and Tsai Ming-liang. And I think at least in Europe, if people know anything about Taiwanese cinema, it tends to be that so-called Taiwan New Cinema. And all these things that came before it, people don't really know much about, and they haven't had much chance to see them.
Well, that's what happened with me. So I knew the new wave, and I thought it was like a continuous development of the cinema. But after your lecture, I understood that Taiwanese people were, I'm not sure of the right word, ashamed of the Taiwan language cinema. So we have some disruption before the new wave and the Taiwanese dialect cinema.
Yes, absolutely right.
Is there any connection
between Taiwanese new cinema and Taiwanese language cinema?
Yeah, where is like some kind of influential on the new wave?
I think that only in a negative sense, to be honest. The new wave filmmakers were highly drawn by things like Italian neorealism and to some extent by French new wave films. The theories and of people like André Bazin with his emphasis on realism. So the kind of star-driven films with sensational plots and so on that we see in Taiwanese language films were regarded with ridicule. You know, they were despised by Taiwan new cinema filmmakers, and they wanted to get away from that. So the impact of film festival culture and art house cinema on the Taiwanese cultural elite was very strong in the 70s and into the 1980s. And you have to remember as well, the government was emphasizing Mandarin language and completely uninterested in these Taiwanese language films as well. So there was a kind of double message. On the one hand, the government was saying, treating Taiwanese language as some sort of inferior dialect, a sign that you were uneducated and, you know, something to be overcome. And then in the cultural elite, although they were not necessarily supportive of the government, they were very drawn by those kind of European art house films.
There was no actually continuous development, right? So the Taiwanese new wave was more influenced by the European cinema and its theory than by the local.
Yes, indeed. And the other type of cinema we need to mention is this Mandarin language cinema, which the government was supporting. And that took two forms. One was government-supported films, which we would have to say were kind of propaganda films, presenting a kind of glossy, optimistic image of Taiwan, which I think, again, were rejected by young people as false. And then very sensationalist tabloid filmmaking by private companies, often taking, you know, murder stories or sex scandals out of the news and turning them into quickly produced films in the 1970s, after the death of Taiwanese language cinema. So all these different forms of filmmaking were, if you like, contesting with each other, and then they were all rejected by the Taiwan new cinema very emphatically. People like Ho Xiaoxian and Edward Yang saw all of that earlier cinema as both inauthentic and also embarrassing.
One would probably say that the auteur theory had help in this rejection.
I think auteur theory and also Bazin's ideas on realism and indexicality. So someone like Ho Xiaoxian worked a lot with untrained actors, with amateurs. They started to try to do sync sound as soon as they could. That was something they hadn't been doing in the industry. And also things like using a mix of different languages in the same film. Because on the streets in Taiwan, of course, you're going to hear people speaking Mandarin, but also speaking Taiwanese, also speaking Hakka, also speaking Shanghainese in some cases. And you would not see that in the films before. The films would be in one language or the other. But with the Taiwan new cinema and their idea of realism, a sort of very similar realism, they followed that kind of multilingual practice.
So, of course, auteur theory was quite influential and interesting way to understand cinema itself. It was influenced by the aesthetic of genius, which was formulated by Kant, but watching the films that were shown, the Taiyupian films, as you said, one should understand them not by auteur theory, but by genre.
Yes, by and large, these are genre films. They were advertised and sold in that way, in the way we think of with Hollywood studio cinema. It was a mix of using the stars to sell them and then using the genre. Either, they lots and lots of melodramas, but also spy films, comedies, even musicals in some cases, and some occasional things like Gothic films, but not many of those. And recently, the Taiwan Film and Audiovisual Institute, which has been restoring the films, has asked, are there auteurs in Taiwan cinema, Taiwanese language cinema? And they have dug up a couple of people who they think of as having a kind of auteur quality. And of course, this is also part of auteur theory and auteur criticism, because in the 50s, when Cahiers du Cinéma began auteur theory, they began it by looking at Hollywood studio cinema and trying to see, were there films that were made as genre films, but where you could see certain patterns, either formal aesthetic patterns or obsessions in terms of certain themes coming through with directors working in that studio system where, the scripts were handed to them and where they didn't have a lot of control over the material they worked for. And in Taiwanese language cinema, they've identified in particular Li Xin and Lin Tuanqiu as candidates to be seen as auteurs.
Do you think it's the right approach?
I think myself, I think I would continue to emphasize more genre and stars, but I don't think it's an illegitimate approach. I think it's okay to look for those kinds of patterns in these directors' work. But I think it would be a mistake to try to give the audience the idea they're going to see art house cinema, because auteur cinema has transformed itself over the decades to mean art house films now. And these films are very much the opposite of that. They're much more entertainment-based, genre-based, star-based movies. And I prefer, when I'm trying to present the films to an audience, to emphasize that quality, that they are, there's always a twist in the films to try to entertain the audience, even if they are very low budget, even if they have limited means. They're not obsessed with, high art at all.
And that, when I was watching those films, one could clearly see that if you go with the mindset of seeing something like the Taiwan New Wave, which was based on auteur theory and did the huge groundbreak, which probably is one of the main influence why the archive, National Taiwanese Archive, would try to sell those films as director's films. But when you drop that and when you compare to the genre cinema of the golden age Hollywood or the 50s Hollywood, it becomes for me much more interesting. Just to see how the genre is exploited.
Yes, I agree. I think these films are highly, very much drawing on three main sources. One is Hollywood, one is Tokyo, and the other one is Hong Kong. And for many of the directors, many of them trained either in Hong Kong or in Tokyo. Of course, they were also exposed to a great many American films, and they were very much modeling themselves on that. It's quite clear from watching the films that there was an aspiration to that kind of studio filmmaking we associate with Hollywood, even though they were doing it on a shoestring budget.
Mm-hmm. How did the influence from Japan come?
Because most of the filmmakers and the audience had been, under Japanese colonization, so they grew up in a culture. The middle-aged people in Taiwan in the 50s and 60s had grown up within Japanese culture. They all had Japanese names as well as their Chinese names, and they absorbed a lot of Japanese pop culture. But even after the end of World War II, Japanese pop culture continued to be very popular in Taiwan. When it was imported, it was very, very well received. So in some cases, some of the films are remakes, direct remakes of Japanese hit films, and others are adaptations of Japanese novels but transposed over into Taiwan, and things like that are quite common.
And Hong Kong?
And Hong Kong, because some of the filmmakers had come through Hong Kong on their way to Taiwan from the mainland. They were not all the filmmakers who worked in the industry were Taiwanese locals who came from local families. Some of the directors and cinematographers were people who'd come over from the mainland with the KMT. But because there were very few opportunities to make Mandarin language films, they got involved with that local industry. And of course, Hong Kong films were also being imported in the 50s and were very popular in Taiwan.
Were the Taiyupian films popular? Did the audiences would wait for those kind of films?
In Taiwan, yes, they were. Even though everyone knew they were lower budget than those other films, people were, especially in the south of the island, where the population that had been there for many generations, the people who had not come over from the mainland in the late 40s, they were more concentrated in the south of the island, and the films were toured around, going to cinemas that often were previously local theaters or sometimes doubled as local theaters. And the producers would often tour the films with the stars. So for the first night or two in a particular town, the audience could actually meet the star, and people would queue up round the block for this. So they were phenomenally popular. But of course, the island of Taiwan is not huge. Its population is in the tens of millions, not in the hundreds or billions. And so the market was not huge. And indeed, in the 50s, Taiwan was still very poor. So ticket prices were very low.
Were they more popular compared to the Mandarin films?
Yes. And the Mandarin films, because at first the local islanders couldn't understand them. There was by no means 100% literacy, so putting subtitles on didn't always help either. That all changed quite quickly, so that let's say by the end of the 1960s, you've got a whole generation of people in their 20s, you've got a population boom, and a whole generation in their 20s who can speak, who can understand at least Mandarin, probably speak it, who are literate, who can read subtitles if they need to. And so the possibilities of understanding and appreciating Mandarin language cinema grew, and the production quality of the Mandarin language films was better because the budgets were higher. So they gradually attracted higher audiences. But at first, it was these Taiwanese language films that were most popular with local audiences.
Can one find some political reality in those films?
I think there's a lot to be. I mean, political reality is a complicated term, but I think there are a lot of ways the films are interesting in regard to this issue. We know that from the late 40s through to the late 80s, Taiwan was under martial law. In 1947, the local population rose up against this new government from the mainland. And so, and that uprising was put down very brutally. And from then on, there was a reign of terror, basically. Accompanying that was very strong censorship. So it is true that none of the films could possibly express some sort of direct opposition, and even indirect opposition would be difficult. But there are a couple of things that I think are interesting to be said about the films in relation to this issue of reality and political reality. One is, because they were low budget, they were often shot on location. And the possibility of building a studio and having a special studio set aside was not there for most of the filmmakers. Just because they were shot on location, so we could see what ordinary street scenes looked like in Taiwan in the 1960s in a way that we couldn't see in the government-supported cinema, which was always so glossy and, you know, rosy in its imagery. It doesn't mean we saw something scandalous, but just we saw ordinary, more ordinary life, ordinary living standards for what they were. But the other thing that I think is important is that these films were made from, they were not made by the government, they were made by local people. And even though the scripts had to pass the censors, the perspective is that of the grassroots. And we can see this very readily if we compare the government films that are promoting development, promoting Taiwan's economic change, which are these so-called healthy realist films, that's what they called them. And all of them present a picture of capitalism delivering great prosperity if people work hard to overcome their challenges. And the archetypal example would be a film called Beautiful Duckling, in which a girl in the countryside gets the idea to raise ducklings with her family. And of course, they go through many problems learning how to do it. But by the end of the film, there are thousands of ducklings running around all over the place in some sort of metaphor for, you know, capitalist prosperity. In contrast to this, the melodramas that are made about in the Taiwanese language cinema are very much typical melodramas of development, as development being dangerous. Again and again, we see young people attracted to the cities by promises of jobs, but when they get there, they discover the jobs are not there. If they're young women, they are drawn into prostitution. Archetypal spaces such as the nightclub as a kind of alluring but very dangerous space appear again and again in these films. There are often, you know, plots involving violence, murders, jail sentences, etc., etc. So it's a much more dystopian image that comes through in some of these films, especially the early films in the early 1960s, when the economic boom was just getting underway. So you get to see a very different local understanding of what was going on.
So one can see a non-intentional critique of modernity.
Yes, indeed. And I think, you know, when there's a theorist called Miriam Hansen, who used to work at University of Chicago. She died a few years ago, sadly. And one of the things she's very well known for is the idea of vernacular modernism. And she uses this term to talk about things like Hollywood studio cinema, to say that she thinks of Hollywood studio cinema as a sensorium involving not just plots and themes, but also the emotions, whereby the audiences negotiated their experience of modernization and development. All the disarming, threatening but also attractive changes that were going on. And I think that's a very good way of thinking about these films. When I see, for example, those nightclub scenes with, frenetic dancing and rock and roll music and things like that, you have this sense of something that's very attractive but very dangerous. And then when you see the acting, which is often looks to us today very over the top, you realize that this is actually allowing the audience to pour their emotions out in the cinema. I was very interested when we showed the films this time in Vilnius. I don't know if you were there. I'm forgetting which film it was now, but we were there one of the days on the weekend. Among the audience were some people who I think were not cinephiles, but just ordinary middle-aged or older people who'd come in and seen the films on the off chance. And I was very struck by one of the questions from one woman who said how she loved the acting and she was very moved by the acting. I thought, oh, that's so interesting, because often younger people criticize the acting and say, oh, it's too fake or exaggerated. But clearly for her, it enabled her, to somehow connect and get some of her emotions out. And she understood what that kind of acting was about.
I remember that lady, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not sure if she understood, but she definitely felt.
Yes, well, that's a kind of understanding as well. Feeling is a kind of understanding.
Because that particular film really was a melodrama, and was full of cries. Right,
exactly. So I think this is very much what the audience went to the cinema for. They went, the other thing we know from talking to people is that the audience was very interactive with the screen. They didn't sit and watch in respectful silence. They shouted at the characters and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it was very much an opportunity to work out all those, frustrations, hopes, fears, sense of, tragedy, whatever in their lives.
We find ourselves a bit in a paradoxical position, because you're a Westerner and I am a half Westerner. So like in Western Europe, but still Eastern, so that's a good position to be. But what is the biggest mistakes? Because I always feel very precautious about saying stuff, especially regarding culture, Asian Eastern culture in general. What are the biggest mistakes when we interpreted those films?
Well, I think there are a few things to say. One thing is, I think actually, I try very hard not to think in terms of East and West, but to understand that the countries in the East are as diverse and different as the countries in the so-called West. And so, it's very noticeable to us that on this tour, these films seem to work for audiences in Lithuania in a way they connected more with audiences in Lithuania than they did in other places. And we don't know exactly why, but obviously there's something going on, some local resonance, small island, small country, big neighbor, etc., that maybe doesn't apply in a place like, France. So I think that's the first thing. But the second thing maybe is what are the underlying ideas of success and good behavior and ethics? And I think in Taiwanese films, we have to remember the legacy of Confucianism, especially, which emphasizes the idea of a successful person as somebody who works out the right way to do their duty, and not necessarily somebody who achieves their individual aims. And often a person who chases their individual aims is going to be seen as somebody who's a failure because they don't have control over themselves. And it's really that many of the plots present a moral quandary in the form of different duties calling on the characters. Who do you try to obey? Your husband, your father, or your son, or your employer, and trying to work all that out is the challenge for the characters. And for us, I think that can be a bit surprising. We're used to the idea of the films that revolve, especially Hollywood films, that revolve a lot around, individuals who triumph against the odds to get what they need and want. Whereas in these films, it's more about being able to, do what you should do to be respectful and to help others.
Could that be said about my previous question about political reality? Because, Lithuanians are obsessed with politics. And when I watched those films, I was trying to see the resistance and something going on there. But while reading one of the reviews of your book, Iceland on the Edge, a commentator said that it's a mistake to see everything in political terms, as a lot of Westerners do. And he emphasized that much more important about Taiyupian films is the Confucian ethics and not the political aspect.
Well, of course, I would say the Confucian ethics are political. But, I think, here's another difference, right? If we use the word in Chinese for politics, it means much more the idea of government. Whereas in English, at least, when we talk about politics, just about everything we mean the play of power in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be government, but it can also be, gender politics. It can also be family politics. Power goes in many different ways. So I think while I understand what that kind of reviewer might be thinking about, I suppose to me that emphasis on Confucianism is still political in many ways. And in fact, there's been a lot of contestation around values within the history of Chinese-speaking cultures, and in different periods, people have wanted to challenge Confucian values and so on.
Can you see that in the contemporary cinema?
I would say, yes, I would say that a lot of contemporary cinema is more interested in individual desire and individual satisfaction. But there is still this tendency to portray individual desire and individual satisfaction in facing a challenge or difficulties from, the family and society at large. And the films still, I'm thinking here especially of Taiwan's sort of famous queer romance subgenre. Every year Taiwan produces 3 or 4, maybe even more, sort of queer romances, very often triangular romances where it's, girl loves boy, but boy loves another boy, and that boy loves the original girl, or something like that. These films very often show these complicated relationships as also being caught up in a society that doesn't make a space for them. And I think where the idea of duty continues to resonate is in the narratives very often ending with people sort of giving in to those larger social expectations. And so the films very often have a kind of bittersweet, tragic, nostalgic quality that suggests, on the one hand, this greater individualistic desire, but so far maybe perhaps still some notion that one should not, to give in inverted commas, to that individualistic desire is a problem. But there are changes, yeah.
Well, that's one of the links how the Westerners see politics. So the relationship between the individual and the government. But while seeing those films and what you just said now, the understanding of the individual, or let's say in more fancy terms, political subject, is different in Taiwan. But you, on one of your presentations, you tried to interpret those films while using Michel de Courteau, a French historian and philosopher. So in one way, I like him because he shows the value of popular culture. There's this American cultural theorist John Fiske. So I like his book. He showed that he let ordinary people enjoy popular culture without being a snob. As if you don't saw Tarkovsky, you saw nothing, because you have the cinephile stuff going on around, especially with the auteur theory. Well, now it's being not so popular, but still, all the festivals are they're doing their programs, even unconsciously, by that theory. So the question saying is that if Courteau works while trying to understand Western pop culture, and Taiyupian is a Taiwanese pop culture, but can it be adequately used on those films?
Okay, so I think something important perhaps that we do need to emphasize is that these films, as I mentioned earlier, were made in the era of martial law culture, a one-party dictatorship. But we also need to recognize that Taiwan has changed hugely since the late 1980s. And it's now a multi-party democracy. And those parties really, unlike, say, Japan, where it's multi-party, but one party has been in control since World War II. In the case of Taiwan, since it became a multi-party democracy, those parties have changed. The government has changed frequently. Furthermore, the culture has become one of, I would say, of distinct communities. People have multiple belongings. They're part of the indigenous community, they're part of a women's organization, they're part of religious groups, etc., etc. And so it's become, in that way, a lot more like Western European culture, I think. And in that way, much more recognizable to those of us coming from Western Europe than it would have been 40 years ago. Now, during the martial law era, I think de Courteau is really a useful, his model is really useful, because he talks about this idea of strategy and tactics. And strategy is, the direction laid out by those who monopolize power. And tactics are all the maneuvers, little local level maneuvers that people undertake, not so much to overthrow or to resist in some big way, but nonetheless to assert their own agency. And I think we can see those films as that kind of tactical culture. It wasn't possible to make, you could not make films that were directly opposing the government. You simply would have ended up in jail, possibly even have been executed. But you could make films that express the local experience of what was going on in various ways, as we've been talking about. And so in that sense, I think they can be seen as tactical. Of course, if you're talking about or trying to theorize how does it become possible later on in the 70s, after the end of Taiwanese language cinema, for more forms to develop that are actually pushing for the end of martial law and the development of multi-party democracy in Taiwan, that's a very different question and something a political scientist would have to answer. But in terms of your reservations about de Soto, I would agree that de Soto doesn't provide, a way of understanding how more radical change begins to happen.
It was also interesting to see, considering the tactics, that at least those films that I saw, Taiyupian films, the tacticians were much more ladies in the films than guys. How to understand that? Because
I think this is really interesting. I agree. There are lots of different factors involved, I think. I think for a long time, Taiwanese authors, playwrights, filmmakers tended to perceive and depict Taiwan, in its situation as a country that had been, or a place, I should say, that had been colonized and then, handed over to the KMT from the mainland. They saw it in this passive position, and they saw this position as somewhat similar to the position of women in a patriarchal culture, being controlled by male authority figures in the form of these much more dominant countries. So the idea of woman as a kind of metaphor for Taiwan is certainly there and is common. Then I think it's also the case that the big audience for these films, the films were popular with everybody, but the big audience was a female audience. This is the era when a lot of women, especially young women, are going to work alone in factories in the cities. They're leaving the farms and being sent off into the cities. So it's not surprising that they're looking for cheap entertainment that speaks to their experiences in one way or another. And then there are also people who argue that historically, if you go way back, it's possible that Taiwanese culture was much more matriarchal than mainstream Chinese culture, which is very patriarchal. I'm not really sure if there are genuine, anthropological researches that support that kind of argument. But I think it is interesting that it's the women who are the main characters and the women who are experiencing this dramatic change and responding to it in a very, much more active way.
Does that proceed till nowadays?
In the films?
Yes.
No, I don't think it does. Not so. I mean, there are many films with female protagonists, but there are also many films with male protagonists who are, much more assertive than we see in these films.
Uh-huh.
But it is interesting. I mean, another thing that maybe I should add to this picture is that the idea of what is the idea of an attractive man or, in Chinese culture. And of course, this is something that is also changing. But historically, researchers have indicated that in Chinese culture, men who are seen as highly educated, but also very polite, very well behaved, maybe a bit more soft in their personality, are perceived as attractive. Whereas men who are much more tough guy are perceived as, yes, they're warriors who can defend our culture or whatever, but they're not seen as attractive to women. So, for example, there is the great 18th century Chinese novel, Story of the Stone, otherwise known as Dream of Red Mansions. And the main young male protagonist in Dream of Red Mansions is a guy called Jia Baoyu, who grows up with and lives entirely in a sort of community of women in the household. And he's a very feminized young man, but he's also seen as being extremely hot from the point of view of the female characters. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, he's the archetype of this kind of, highly refined, soft masculinity that is seen as more attractive to women. So perhaps that's also got something to do with these male characters who we perceive as a bit passive.
Why were so much films lost?
Yes, of course, this is the tragedy. Of these, well over 1,000 films made, only a couple of hundred survive. There are various reasons for this. One reason is just the climate in Taiwan. It's very hot and humid, which is very bad for celluloid. Mm-hmm. There was no film archive until the late 1970s. So when the Taiwanese film industry ended, there was no archive collecting the films. The films were made by lots and lots of small private companies that went bankrupt. When they went bankrupt, everything got thrown away. All of these reasons combined, and also the lack of value placed on the films for quite a long time, means that they were not really collected. And it's just good luck that fortunately a whole load of them were discovered in a film laboratory, not a film production company, but a development laboratory, when it went bankrupt at the end of the 1970s and the film archive was set up. Unfortunately, among the films were some Taiwanese language films.
Could this be an argument? Could this be an argument against authoritarian? Because, let's say, in Europe in Middle Ages, so people were not signing their own works because nobody has such a strong feeling of their individuality.
And there was no copyright either.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, the origin of artwork used to be understood as emanation of God, in some sense, or emanation or illumination is the right word. So, and only after 18th century, in the beginning of 19th, we have a very strong understanding of authorship, which maybe is not comparable to the idea that idea is not transferable to Taiwan. Because I understand even if the film was not commercially successful, it's strange that the director would not care about the copies of his film.
Well, I think the directors might have cared, but they didn't have any control because they didn't own them. They were owned by the companies and the producers. And so, in fact, one of the difficulties in Taiwan, because it is a capitalist country in its history, is that who actually owns the rights to these surviving films is not always easy to determine. And it's made it quite difficult to get permission to, for example, release the films, re-release the films, or make them available in the kinds of prints, new versions that we've been seeing. But I think the filmmakers themselves may well have valued and probably did value their films, but it was the production companies that owned them, not the filmmakers.
But even the production guys, I mean, still, why? They didn't care, right?
No, they were investors. So, I mean, I don't mean to sound, like a classic left-wing critic of capitalism, but, capitalists are not so, they're interested in making money. When the Taiwanese film language died, these guys took their money and invested in other things. They weren't going to use their money to hang on to this stuff. It wasn't making any more profit for them. So it was just abandoned, basically. But that actually is not an attitude that was found in Taiwan alone. In general, around the world, a lot of early cinema was seen as just an entertainment. And it wasn't, it was seen, the idea was you would show it, people would enjoy it, and then you moved on to the next film. There was no real attention paid to storing the films or looking after them until much later.
Well, yeah, you can remember that for the first 20 years, the film theoreticians were mainly interested in showing that film is an art and not a circus.
Yes, that's right. And of course, that is itself part of our values where, or historically our values, at least in Europe, where for something to be worth saving, it has to be seen as an art form. For it to be seen as an art form, there has to be an artist, and hence auteur theory.
Mm-hmm. How does the the population of Taiwan perceive those films? Do they get some interest?
I think that for most young Taiwanese, it's another world. Taiwan has changed so much in the last 40, 50 years that it's very hard for them to relate easily to these films. And that, for some of them, then, on the other hand, is what makes them curious about them. Precisely because it enables them to suddenly discover, Taiwan looked like that not that long ago. It's very, very surprising to them. So for some of them, for cinephiles and for people who have got a stronger interest in local culture again, these films are interesting. They're part of the process of building up and rebuilding local identity and local culture. And because they're so different from those Mandarin language films, which had been kept more carefully by the government, I think they do come as a surprise to audiences. Also, we have to say, because they are low-budget films, they're often quite quirky. They're full of some weird and wacky things that are funny. And for young audiences, they sometimes have a kind of cult quality, a little bit of a cult quality. And you can see that in some films more than others. I think I probably mentioned when I was talking in Vilnius about a film called, The Legend of the Deer Warrior. Fantasy of the Deer Warrior. And, this film is one in which the animal kingdom appears in the form of human actors dressed up in, fuzzy costumes and things. And to us, it looks like cosplay, almost early cosplay. So I think young audiences in Taiwan treat that kind of film as a sort of cult film. But then other films, maybe they see it more as a way to connect to the culture that their grandparents and great-grandparents came from.
I remember you showed the clip from that film, so it was quite bizarre.
It is bizarre, yeah. I think also, as well as this trying to understand where their families and their parents and great-grandparents came from historically, there's also this ever-growing sense of local distinctiveness. And because these films were very distinctively Taiwanese, there's nothing like this cinema being made anywhere else at this time. In the sense that it's in Taiwanese, it's about Taiwan, it's all full of local cultural phenomena. It helps to build that strong sense of a local identity, which is very, very much prevalent in Taiwan these days.
Why?
Why? I think for various reasons, but of course, the difficult relationship with the mainland is part of it. Mm-hmm. Historically, when Taiwan was liberated from Japanese colonialism, of course, for many people, there was this question of, would we become part of China again, literally really integrate into China and become fully Sinicized? And that was the vision the government had. But when the government lost the civil war with the communists and became cut off from mainland China, that the possibility of a real sense of belonging to China was not really there, especially for the local population who'd been colonized by the Japanese for so long. For those people, they'd never been to China and they had no chance to go to China during the Cold War. So for anyone who is now, I suppose, under 70 years old in Taiwan, they're most likely people who were born and grew up on the island and have a strong sense of themselves as local islanders. And now, of course, as we know, mainland China is asserting its claim to Taiwan more and more strongly. There's a kind of logic that says now that Hong Kong has been returned to China, the next is Taiwan. And I think local islanders, in reaction to that, are, partly in reaction to that, are becoming more and more people who think of themselves as Taiwanese first. And that includes the children and grandchildren of the people who came over in the late 1940s.
So their political consciousness is shaped by the possibility of aggression?
Yes. There's a strong desire to deny that, to say, oh, it's never going to happen, they won't ever attack. But of course, more recently, especially in the last year or two, China has been doing things like sending bombers flying over Taiwan and so on, and it's become less and less possible for Taiwanese people to totally ignore that possibility. Just as Putin has been lining his troops up on the border with Ukraine, for a long time you could say, oh, it's just, to try to put pressure on us. But eventually you have to think, well, maybe it isn't. And so, of course, in reaction to that, people start to resist.
Well, the Ukraine had already lost a part of it.
Yes, indeed.
So this is fresh history.
Indeed.
But China, considering its long history, was never colonial power. It never had a tendency to expand.
Not in the European sense, but of course, China has always been an empire, and it's expanded by absorbing the states and the cultures around the core culture in the eastern coastal area. And that's why you have so many different spoken languages in China that are mutually incompatible and incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. Because those places were not originally part of Chinese culture, but they've become absorbed over many hundreds of years into Chinese culture. In the case of Taiwan, it's complicated. Even the most ardent Chinese nationalist will acknowledge that Taiwan, if you go back a few hundred years, Taiwan was not inhabited by Chinese people. It was inhabited by people from the South Pacific, mm-hmm. Austronesian people, who are now known as the indigenous Taiwanese. They're less than 5% of the local population, and they're mostly concentrated up in the mountains. But people started migrating from China in the 16th, 17th centuries. And so people understand it's a settler, a place that has been settled.
How do you view the Lithuanian stance on
On Taiwan?
Yes.
I think it's very interesting. I think it shows Lithuania's understanding of the Taiwanese situation through its own experience of dealing with the Soviet Union and now Russia, and its desire to maintain its own distinctiveness and its own self-determination, and an understanding and a sympathy for other small nations that have that kind of wish. For me, it's interesting as well because, of course, it throws out a challenge to other European powers, not to be hostile towards the People's Republic of China, but also not to just automatically go along with what the PRC wants, and instead to think about, what Europe believes in and what Europe wants to support.
How would you answer to the negative arguments that politics is politics, but business is business? I'm also speaking now as a true Marxist, but
yes, well, if you're a Marxist, of course, business and politics are not easily distinguished. But I guess what I would say is, as we are seeing in the difficult relationships that we have at the moment with the PRC and with Russia as well, while I think we would not necessarily want to be, I would not want to interfere in what goes on in another country. What do you do if that country starts to interfere with what goes on in your country? And that's where, maybe you have to say, creating a situation of economic dependence through business can be very dangerous. And that's what they've been discovering in Taiwan as well. Economically, Taiwan is very, very much closely tied up with People's Republic. Lots of Taiwanese businesses have been investing in People's Republic of China, depending on cultural and economic similarities and linguistic similarities, as well as personal links through history and so on, to establish their businesses there. And of course, that is now understood to have created a great vulnerability.
How do you think, if to prophesize a bit, how the relationship will develop?
Between Taiwan and the PRC?
Yes.
I think it's impossible to tell. I really do. I mean, I think, I think there are so many different factors at play. For example, you may have heard of a company called Evergrande, which is the world's biggest property company, and is a Chinese company, and it seems to be going bankrupt, owing billions and billions of dollars around the world, but mostly within China. If it goes bankrupt, it's almost certainly going to cause a lot of political problems for the Chinese government. We know that when governments have a lot of domestic problems, that's when having an adventure overseas to distract the local population, to arouse patriotism, is very tempting. So, you just can't tell. Are they actually, is there a real imminent risk of war or something like that? I hope not. I would like to think not. But I think it's become harder to be confident that it won't happen. I think that the local population in Taiwan is becoming less and less inclined to want to be ruled from Beijing or to be part of mainland China. So I think the desire to resist it is also getting stronger. And of course, conquering an island is very difficult. So, you know, there are good reasons for the mainland government to think twice before it launches anything like that. What is also important to note is that for the last many decades, we've all operated on a kind of fiction, you know, where we pretend Taiwan doesn't exist, but we also trade with Taiwan. We have diplomatic representation in indirect ways and so on. And I wonder how much longer that can go on. You know, so maybe what has been a very stable situation is going to change, but I honestly can't tell how it will end up changing.
Going back to the films where we started, a very general question that they always ask people who have some interest or doing work with films, which actually is quite a hard question for a lot of them. What is the criteria for a good film, for the art of cinema?
I think there are lots of different criteria depending on where you're coming from. It depends on, you know, whether you're thinking in terms of cinema as a mass entertainment form and you are interested in what the audience wants to watch, or whether you are coming from an art cinema position, etc., etc. So I don't think there is any one criterion for judging a good film. My own personal taste is normally quite towards art house cinema. I like Taiwanese cinema very much. I like the fact that it is slow and allows you to get absorbed into what's going on the screen. But that's just my personal taste. I don't have an answer for you in terms of, you know, I don't think there are any kind of objective ways of saying this is a good film.
So you don't believe in those ontologies that were done by Bazin or others who had one criteria to establish the quality of film?
No, I don't. So, I mean, I think that it's possible also to understand that different kinds of cinema work or are successful in different circumstances for different audiences at different times. So I'm not inclined, I don't believe in this idea of cinema as one thing, as some essential truth or some ontological truth of cinema that gets realized in its greatest creations. I think cinema is many different things and has many different potentials. But perhaps one could add that within each of those, different practices, there are, of course, arguments about what constitutes, great art house cinema, what constitutes a good documentary at the moment in China, say, or something like that. And I can have different ideas about that, I guess, but I'm not in favor. I'm not somebody who holds to absolute values.
Can you recommend, please, a film, a Taiyupian film, Taiwanese dialect film that could be easily accessible, if you know such one, to watch it on the nice evening?
I actually don't know if there are any whole films at the moment with subtitles available, for example, on YouTube, Taiwanese language films. But some of them are available on DVD through specialist Asian film suppliers and so on. I would say that if you can get your hands on it, probably a good place to start would be a film like Dangerous Youth, which we can relate to quite easily as a kind of 1960s generation gap youth culture film, even though it's got its own distinctive characteristics. And it's the one that pretends to be set in Hong Kong because it shows too much corruption in Taiwan. But nonetheless, it's, I think, quite an interesting film that if you like, for example, French New Wave or Japanese New Wave, you might also be able to relate to and enjoy Dangerous Youth.
Chris, thank you for your time.
Thank you.